Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to this next and latest session of our uh, continuation of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We'll be starting chapter 4 today, and I'm uh, glad y'all have joined us. We've been making good progress. As always, the PDF, if you're here in the live session, is in the pinned section of this Walter Rodney Discord channel. And if you are following along on the YouTube, after we upload it, you can find that same PDF in the description. Let me pull it up and we'll be ready to get started. Yeah, we've been making good progress so far, and there's been quite a lot to learn from this. So, Chapter 4, Europe and the Roots of African Underdevelopment to 1885. 4.1. The European slave trade as a basic factor in African underdevelopment. To discuss trade between Africans and Europeans in the 4 centuries before colonial rule is virtually to discuss slave trade. Strictly speaking, the African only became a slave when he reached a society where he worked as a slave. Before that, he was first a free man and then a captive. Nevertheless, it is acceptable to talk about the trade in slaves to refer to the shipment of captives from Africa to various other parts of the world where they were to live and work as the property of Europeans. The title of this section is deliberately chosen to call attention to the fact that the shipments were all by Europeans to markets controlled by Europeans. And this was in the interest of European capitalism and nothing else. In East Africa and the Sudan, many Africans were taken by Arabs and were sold to Arab buyers. This is known in European books, that's an important distinction, as the Arab slave trade. Therefore, let it be clear that when Europeans shipped Africans to European buyers, it was the European slave trade from Africa. Undoubtedly, with few exceptions such as Hawkins, European buyers purchased African captives on the coast of Africa, and the transaction between themselves and African was a form of trade. It is also true that very often a captive was sold and resold as he made his way from the interior to the point of embarkation. And that too was a form of trade. However, on the whole, the process by which captives were obtained on African soil was not trade at all. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. When one tries to measure the effect of European slave trading on the African continent, it is very essential to realize that one is measuring the effect of social violence rather than trade in any normal sense of the word. Many things remain uncertain about the slave trade and its consequences for Africa, but the general picture of destructiveness is clear, and the destructiveness can be shown to be the logical consequence of the manner of recruitment of captors in Africa. One of the uncertainties concerns the basic question of how many Africans were imported. This has long been an object of speculation, with estimates ranging from a few million to over 100 million. A recent study has suggested a figure of about 10 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, and Europe. Because it is a low figure, it is already being used by European scholars who are apologists for the capitalist system and its long record of brutality in Europe and abroad. In order to whitewash the European slave trade, they find it convenient to start by minimizing the numbers concerned. The truth is that any figure of Africans imported into the Americas, which is narrowly based on the surviving records, is bound to be low, because there were so many people at the time who had a vested interest in smuggling slaves and withholding data. Well, yeah. What are you gonna do otherwise? Believe that they're unethical enough to engage in slavery, but upstanding enough to keep everything on the record? Obviously not. Nevertheless, if the low figure of 10 millions was accepted as a basis for evaluating the impact of slaving on Africa as a whole, the conclusions that could the conclusions that could legitimately be drawn would confound those who attempt to make light of the experience of the rape of Africans from 1445 to 1870. On any basic figure of Africans landed alive in the Americas, one will have to make several extensions, starting with a calculation to cover mortality and transshipment. The Atlantic crossing, or Middle Passage, as it was called by European slavers, was notorious for the number of deaths incurred, averaging in the vicinity of 15 to 20%. There were also numerous deaths in Africa between time of capture and time of embarkation, especially in cases where captives had to travel hundreds of miles to the coast. Most important of all, given that welfare was the principal means of obtaining captives, it is necessary to make some estimate as to the number of people killed and injured so as to extract the millions who were taken alive and sound. The resultant figure would be many times the millions landed alive outside of Africa. And it is that figure which represents the number of Africans directly removed from the population and labor force of Africa because of the establishment of slave production by Europeans. The massive loss to the African labor force was made more critical because it was composed of able-bodied young men and young women. Slave buyers pervert their victims between the ages of 15 and 35, and preferably in the early 20s. The sex ratio between being about 2 men to 1 woman. Europeans often accepted younger African children, but rarely any older person. They shipped the most healthy wherever possible, taking the trouble to get those who had already survived an attack of smallpox and who were therefore immune from further attacks of that disease, which was then one of the world's great killer diseases. Yeah, so like it's really interesting how he's talking about them embellishing numbers in order to like do this narrative of what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't as many people, as you think. Like that's kind of like the logic that they try to go with. I've had people not only try to downplay how many people were enslaved as if even one person being enslaved is acceptable in the first place. Not only have they tried to embellish those numbers, I've even had people try to like straight up say that the number of even slave owners is actually supposedly not that great, and then they'll make up or they'll bring up all kinds of so-called data about the Southerner to slave owner ratio or something along those lines. I've had people say like only, like something like, what was the statistic I saw? Something like 7% of people actually had slaves. And of those people who did have slaves, most of those folks only had like 2 or 3. And this is like the logic that these fucking people use, as if words like only and not that much and shit like that can ever be okay when used in the context of, well, fucking slavery. It's like some wild shit. Can y'all think of some examples of like ridiculous embellishment or a ridiculous downplaying of like facts that y'all could think of? If so, mention it in the chat. So, absence of data about the size of Africa's population in the 15th century makes it difficult to carry out any scientific assessment of the results of the population overflow. But nothing suggests that there was any increase in the continent's population over the centuries of slaving, although that was the trend in other parts of the world. Obviously, fewer babies were born than would otherwise have been the case in millions of childbearing ages were not eliminated. Besides, it is essential to recognize that the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean was not the only connection which Europeans had with slaving in Africa. The slave trade on the Indian Ocean has been called the East African slave trade and the Arab slave trade for so long that it hides the extent to which it was also a European slave trade. When the slave trade from East Africa was at its height in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, the destination of most captives was the European-owned plantation economies of Mauritius Reunion, and Seychelles, as well as the Americas via the Cape of Good Hope, resides Africans laboring as slaves in certain Arab countries in the 18th and 19th century were all ultimately serving the European capitalist system, which set up a demand for slave-grown products, such as the cloves grown uh, Zanzibar under the supervision of Arab masters. No one has been able to come up with a figure representing total losses to the African population sustained through the extraction of slave labor from all areas to all destinations over the many centuries that slave trade existed. However, on every other continent from the 15th century onwards, the population showed constant and sometimes spectacular natural increase, while it is striking that the same did not apply to Africa. One European scholar gave the following estimates of world population in millions according to continents: 1650, 100 million; 1750, 100 million in Africa; 1850, 100 million in Africa; 1900, 120 million; 103 million in Europe in 1650; 144 million, 274, and then 423 million. And then Asia is 257, 437, 656, and 857. None of the above figures are really precise, but they do indicate a consensus among researchers on population that the huge African continent has an abnormal record of stagnation in this respect. And there is no causative factor other than the trade in slaves to which attention can be drawn. An emphasis on population loss as such is highly relevant to the question of socio-economic development. Population growth played a major role in European development and providing labor markets and the pressures which lead to further advance. Japanese population growth has similar positive effects. In the other parts of Asia, which remain pre-capitalist, the size of the population led to a much more intensive exploitation of the land that has ever been the case in what is still the sparsely peopled African continent. So long as the population density was low, then humans being viewed as units of labor were far more important than other factors of production, such as land. From one end of the continent to the other, it is easy to find examples that African people were conscious that population was, in their circumstances, the more important factor of production. Among the Bemba, the instances, for instance, numbers of subjects were held to be more important than land. Among the Shambhala of Tanzania, the same feeling was expressed in the saying, "A king is people." Among the Belanta of Guinea-Bissau, the family strength is represented by the number of hands there are to cultivate the land. Certainly, many African rulers acquiesced in the European slave trade for what they considered to be reasons of self-interest. Yeah, that makes sense. But on no scale of rationality could the outflow of population be measured as anything but disastrous for African societies. African economic activity was affected both directly and indirectly by population loss. For instance, when the inhabitants of a given area were reduced below a certain number in an environment where tsetse fly was present, the remaining few had to abandon the area. In effect, enslavement was causing these people to lose their battle to tame and harness nature, a battle which is at the basis of development. Violence also meant insecurity. The opportunity presented by European slave dealers became the major, though not the only, stimulus for a great deal of social violence between different African communities and within any given community. It took the form more of raiding and kidnapping than of regular welfare. All right, so we could pause for discussion for a second. So one of the things that it's mentioned here in this first small part is like we were talking about this, like embellishment of the numbers in order to create preemptively this kind of narrative, about what the scale of slavery even was. Because if you can embellish the numbers, then and downplay the severity of exactly what it was that was happening, then what you get to do is, well, do exactly what's happened. You get to blame the so-called underdevelopment and the conditions on the actual locals. They'll say stuff like, they resisted progress. They'll say stuff like what was the one comrade saying earlier? They resist modernity. They do not allow, the country to like prosper, and they're unwelcoming to like the coming settlers who just wanted to like, facilitate growth in the country, and so when you talk about embellishing these numbers, these are the kind of narratives that get set up and get crafted whenever these people get involved, that embellishment. So like that's why it's super important for Rodney to bring that up. Then he says, and then he of course talks about the way the African economy was impacted by the population loss that necessarily came from the slave trade. He says, for instance, when the inhabitants of a given area were reduced below a certain number, the remaining had to abandon the area. So, like, not only were they losing the people who were being kidnapped, people then themselves felt the need to leave the area just for fear of not ending up like their family and friends who'd been kidnapped by these colonizing invaders. There's a downpour in terms of what ends up happening in an area when settlers show up looking to kidnap people to sell them into slavery. It's obviously devastating. What else we have here? And then, yeah, we can continue on. Both openly and by implication, all the Europeans' powers in the 19th century indicated their awareness of the fact that the activities connected with producing captives were inconsistent with other economic pursuits. That was the time when Britain, in particular, wanted Africans to collect palm produce and rubber to grow agricultural crops for exports in place of slaves. And it was clear that slave raiding was violently conflicting with that objective in Western, Eastern, and Central Africa. Long before that date, Europeans accepted the fact when their self-interest was involved. For example, in the 17th century, the Portuguese and Dutch actually discouraged slave trade on the Gold Coast, for they recognized that it could be incompatible with gold trade. However, by the end of that century, gold had been discovered in Brazil, and the importance of gold supplies from Africa was lessened. Within the total Atlantic pattern, African slaves became more important than gold. And the Brazilian gold was offered for African captives at Whydah, Dahomey, and Accra. At that point, slaving began undermining the Gold Coast economy and destroying the gold trade. Slave raiding and kidnapping made it unsafe to mine and to travel with gold, and raiding for captives proved more profitable than gold mining. Raiding was more profitable than gold mining. It's not something that I'd heard before, but it makes sense just even hearing it conceptually, unfortunately. One European on the scene noted that as one fortunate marauding makes a native rich in a day, they therefore exert themselves rather in war, robbery, and plunder than in their old business of digging and collecting gold. The above changeover from gold mining to slave raiding took place within a period of a few years between 1700 and 1710. When the Gold Coast came to supply about 5,000 to 6,000 captives per year, by the end of the 18th century, a much smaller number of captives were exported from the Gold Coast, but the damage had already been done. It is worth noting that Europeans sought out different parts of West and Central Africa at different times to play the role of major suppliers of slaves to the Americas. This meant that virtually every section of the long west coastline between the Senegal and Kwame rivers had at least a few years' experience of intensive trade in slaves, with all its consequences. Besides, in the history of eastern Nigeria, the Congo, northern Angola, and Dahomey, there were periods extending over decades when exports remained at an average of many thousands per year. Uh, Most of those areas were also relatively high developed within the African context. They were led rig forces inside Africa, whose energies would otherwise have gone toward their own self-improvement and the betterment of the continent as a whole. The changeover to warlike activities and kidnapping must have affected all branches of economic activity, and agriculture in particular. Occasionally, in certain localities, food production was increased to provide supplies for slave ships. But the overall consequence of slaving on agricultural activities in Western, Eastern, and Central Africa were negative. Labor was drawn off from agriculture and conditions became unsettled. Dahomey, which in the 16th century was known for exporting foods to parts of what is now Togo, was suffering from famines in the 19th century. The present generation of Africans will readily recall that in the colonial period, when able-bodied men left their homes as migrant work laborers, that upset the farming routine in the home districts and often caused famines. Slave trading, after all, meant migration of labor in a manner 100 times more brutal and disruptive. Yeah. One of the most insidious things that they did was cut people off from the land itself necessarily being a primary mode of production in the country. And if you constantly are having to, literally flee in order to avoid capture by these colonial pigs, your means of sustenance is necessarily compromised as you find yourself, having to stay on the move to survive. This is not one of the realities of slavery that they talk about, but this is one of the realities that we've learned to be true, and in many ways was kind of always implied, unfortunately. So, to achieve economic development, one essential condition is to make the maximum use of the country's labor and natural resources, of course. Usually that demands peaceful conditions, but there have been times in history when social groups have grown stronger by raiding their neighbors for women, cattle, and goods, because they then used the booty from the raids for the benefit of their own community. Slaving in Africa did not even have that redeeming value. Captives were shipped outside instead of being utilized within any given African community for creating wealth from nature. It was only an accidental byproduct that in some areas, Africans who recruited captives for Europeans realized that they were better off keeping some captives for themselves. In any case, slaving prevented the remaining population from effectively engaging in agriculture and industry, and it employed professional slave hunters and warriors to destroy rather than build. Might apart from the moral aspect and the immense suffering that it caused, the European slave trade is economically totally irrational from the viewpoint of African development. For certain purposes, it is necessary to be more specific and to speak of the trade in slaves not in general continent-wide terms, but rather with reference to the varying impact on several regions. The relative intensity of slave raiding in different areas is fairly well known. Some South African peoples were enslaved by the Boers and some North African Muslims by Christian Europeans, but those were minor episodes. The zones most notorious for human exports were, firstly, West Africa from Senegal to Angola along a belt extending about 200 miles inland, and secondly, that part of East Central Africa, which today covers Tanzania, Mozambique, Malawi, northern Zambia, and eastern Congo. Furthermore, within each of these broad areas, finer distinctions can be drawn. It might therefore appear that slavery trade did not universally affect the development of some parts of Africa simply because exports were non-existent or at a low level. However, the contention that European slave trade was an underdeveloping factor for the continent as a whole must be upheld, because it does not follow that an African district which did not trade with Europe was entirely free from whatever influences were exerted by Europe. European trade goods percolated into the deepest interior, and more significantly, the orientation of large areas of the continent towards human exports. The other positive interactions were thereby ruled out. The above proposition may be more fully grasped by making some comparisons. In any given economy, the various components reflect the well-being of others. Therefore, when there is depression in one sector, that depression invariably transfers itself to others to some extent. Similarly, when there is buoyancy in one sector, then others benefit. Turning to biological sciences, it will be found that students of ecology recognize that a single change, such as the disappearance of a small species, could trigger off negative or positive reactions in spheres that superficially appear unconnected. Parts of Africa left free by export trends and captives must have been affected by the tremendous dislocation in ways that are not easy to comprehend, because it is so much a question of what might have happened. Hypothetical questions such as what might have happened sometimes lead to absurd speculations. But it is entirely legitimate and very necessary to ask what might have happened in Barati land, southern Zambia, if there were not generalized slave trading across the whole belt of Central Africa, which lay immediately north of Barati land. What would have happened in Buganda if the Katangese were concentrating on selling copper to Buganda instead of captives to Europeans? During the colonial epoch, the British forced Africans to sing, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." The British themselves started singing the tune in the early 18th century, at the height of using Africans as slaves. What would have been Britain's level of development had millions of them been put to work as slaves outside of their homeland over a period of 4 centuries? Furthermore, assuming that those wonderful fellows could never have been slaves, one could speculate further on the probable effects on their development had continental Europe been enslaved. Had that been the case, its nearest neighbors would have been removed from the ambit of fruitful trade with Britain. After all, trade between the British Isles and places like the Baltic and the Mediterranean is unanimously considered by scholars to have been the earliest stimulus to the English economy in the late feudal and early capitalist period, even before the era of overseas expansion. That's a really interesting point he's bringing up there, because he's talking about this idea, whether implicitly or even maybe he's attempting to be explicit here, that like the conditions that necessarily result as a consequence of slavery are somehow natural, and he's obviously debunking the idea that that's not natural, because the British themselves are bragging about this idea that they themselves would never find themselves enslaved, and to like some extent that like necessarily seems to be like commentary on the nature of the kind of people who would enslave folks in the first place. Because like if Britons are saying, if British folks at that time were talking about we'll never, never, never be enslaved, are they giving commentary on their infallible, indomitable, unconquerable nature, or are they acknowledging that like enslaving entire groups of other humans is, for the most part, not something that would ever be perpetrated by who ended up being the most marginalized groups on anywhere near the scale as the British ended up doing it. I mean, I suppose both can be true. It could be it could be the case that they both find themselves to like not be so supposedly enslavable, whatever the fuck that means to them, and at the same time, nobody else would go anywhere near as far as what they ended up doing. So I wonder if I wonder if that's Rodney's perspective. Perhaps we'll find out as we continue with the reading. You said they still sing that shitty song, Sadu, in Britain today.
Yeah, I think like there was this some kind of event, and like some people were talking about like how like they shouldn't sing this song because it's fucking racist. But and then like there was this big like uproar from all these like conservative people about how it's our tradition and shit to sing this song. I think it was some kind of event or something. But yeah, I think they ended up singing that song in the event. So yeah, yeah, they still sing this.
Oh, so like the kind of discourse around that song is like similar to like the discourse that like happens around the American flag or the Confederate flag, basically here in
Yeah,
America.
kinda, yeah. They still reminisce about the imperial past, like, do you know what I mean?
So like, is there not even any kind of material acknowledgement of what it was? Like, do they like try to like uphold that without going as far as saying like they were proud to be fucking slavers, or will some people like go mask off and straight up be like, yeah, we were never better off than when we were enslaving Africans? Like, what's the kind of language they
Yeah.
use to like
But
try to
like
dress it up, or do?
one thing they try to say to justify it or something, like they say, oh, we're the first ones to stop it as well. It's like doesn't justify anything.
Oh shit! Like, I'm gonna set a fire and I'm gonna put it out, and then I'm gonna expect credit for having put out a fire.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
uh, that's fucking
And
wild.
plus, like the only reason they stopped, like from this book that I was reading, like there was like regular, like every like 30, 40 years, there was regular uprisings like all over the Caribbean. They were scared, like especially after Haiti, they were proper scared. Like that's the only reason. They didn't do it out of their goodwill. Do you know what I mean?
No, of course not. Of course not. That sounds like exactly like the intent, like some shit that you would hear them say. So like when they're caught out on it, and they you claim that like the colonial history itself is nothing to be proud of. Like, how will like the people who want to defend that past typically respond?
Yeah, they start going into like whataboutism and stuff as well. Like they talk about like
Ah,
oh the Arabs and the Ottomans they did this stuff too and stuff like that.
a
Yeah,
lot of
that's the
conflating,
usual
huh?
go-to. Yeah,
Oh wow, that's wild. But it's not surprising. That sounds.
yeah. Like the 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 interesting thing about like Britain's like empire, like it was like they didn't get crushed like every other like empire. They didn't get toppled. Like, do you know what I mean? It's just gradually like America just took it away from them.
Yeah,
So
it
like,
crumbled, and
yeah,
yeah, it crumbled more so than it was. I mean, it was undermined and it was dismantled. But like you said, I mean, England's still around today. you know, British is still around today, and it's
yeah,
more or
imperial
less.
power.
Yeah, exactly. It's still an imperial power, and it always has been. It's not at its height, but fuck, it's nothing's fundamentally changed in terms of its relationship to the world. Literally, the only thing that's changed is the scale. That's about
Yeah, they just took like a subordinate role to the Americans and just yeah.
it. Exactly. I appreciate that,
I think like
comrade. For
other empires like throughout history, I think like most of them they got like conquered by another empire and they got toppled, they just completely destroyed. And that didn't happen to Britain. So it's like something in the consciousness of the people, like they
well, it
still they
might be.
still have that imperial mindset, I think.
Well, it's funny that you mention that because it might necessarily be the case that because like world capitalism was building up its productive forces uh, at the same time that the British Empire was crumbling, and as the Americans began colonizing and taking more and more territory, it might have necessarily been the case that the logic of capitalism itself necessarily played out in a way that made the Americans calculus decide that some relationship with Britain and France and a few other colonial powers might necessarily be, well, necessary. And I mean, you can see that logic playing out and who they try and who they choose to have relationships with in certain regions of the world, even when it comes to decolonizing uh, Asia. You can read all about how the calculus after World War II was to try to figure out if they can get colonial Japan rule reinstalled in the Koreas so that they could rule Korea by proxy. Because like the plan was to like reinstall Japan and then leverage aid, to Japan in its attempt to help build Japan back up in the post-war effort in order to try to bend Japan to its own imperial will, and to some extent, that's ended up being how it's played out for the last, how long has it been since the war ended? 76 years. So
Yeah.
it's that's the logic of it. I appreciate you bringing up that analysis, comrade. So one tactic that is now being employed by certain European, including American scholars, is to say that the European slave trade was undoubtedly a moral evil, but it was economically good for Africa. Okay. Uh, Here, attention will be drawn only very briefly to a few of those arguments to indicate how ridiculous they can be. One that receives much emphasis, that African rulers and other persons obtained Europe commodities in exchange for their captives, and this was how Africans gained quote unquote wealth. This suggestion fails to take into account the fact that several European imports were competing with and strangling African products. It fails to take into account the fact that none of the long list of European articles were of the type which enter into the productive process, but were rather items to be rapidly consumed or stowed away uselessly. And it incredibly overlooks the fact that the majority of the imports were of the worst quality, even as consumer goods. Cheap gin, cheap gunpowder, pots and kettles full of holes, beads, and other assorted rubbish. I mean, yeah, it goes into this old colonized people joke that like Europeans can't make shit. That's the reason that they get involved in imperialism as heavily as they do. It goes the old adage, because there's like not only is Rodney right when he points out what it doesn't take into account. The other thing that's like the elephant in the room is like, who was it creating wealth for in Africa? Because certainly your average African wasn't benefiting economically, if anybody benefited economically at all from the colonization and enslavement of people. I don't even see how they can delude themselves into believing that's true. Like that's just so absurdly and obviously horseshit. I don't even know like where to begin like shitting on that idea, because well, it just sounds untrue on its face before you even do any kind of rudimentary investigation. Like that's a wild thing to say. So following from the above, it is suggested that certain African kingdoms grew strong economically and politically, a consequence of the trade with Europeans. The greatest of the West African kingdoms, such as Oyo, Benin, Dahomey, and Asante, are cited as examples. Oyo and Benin were great before making contact with Europeans, and while both Dahomey and Asante grew stronger during the period of the European slave trade, the roots of their achievements went back to much earlier years. Furthermore, and this is a major fallacy in the argument of the slave trade apologists, the fact that a given African state grew politically more powerful at the same time as it engaged in selling captives to Europeans is not automatically to be attributed to the credit of the trade in slaves. Cholera epidemic may kill thousands in a country, and yet the population increases. The increase obviously came about in spite of and not because of the cholera. This simple logic escapes those who speak about the European slave trade benefiting Africa, literally, exactly what we were saying. The destructive tendency of slave trading can be clearly established, and wherever a state seemingly progressed in the epoch of slave trading, the conclusion is simply that it did so in spite of the adverse effects of a process that was more damaging than cholera. This is the picture that emerges from a detailed study of Dahomey. For instance, and in the final analysis, although Dahomey did its best to expand politically and militarily while still tied to the slave trade, that form of economic activity seriously undermined its economic base and left it much worse off. A few of the arguments about the economic benefits of the European slave trade for Africa amount to nothing more than saying that exporting millions of captives was a way of avoiding starvation in Africa. To attempt to reply to that would be painful and time wasting. But perhaps a slightly more subtle version of the same argument requires a reply. Namely, the argument that Africa gained because in the process of slave trading, new food crops were acquired from the American continent, and these became staples in Africa. The crops in question are maize and cassava, which became staples in Africa late in the 19th century and in the present century. But the spread of food crops is one of the most phenomena in human history. It's one of the most common phenomena in human history. Most crops originated in only one of the continents, and then social contract caused their transfer to other parts of the world. Trading in slaves has no special bearing on whether crops spread the simplest forms of trade would have achieved the same result. Today, the Italians have heard wheat foods like spaghetti and macaroni as their staple, or they have hard wheat foods like spaghetti and macaroni as their staple, while most Europeans use the potato. The Italians took the idea of the spaghetti-type foods from the Chinese noodle after Marco Polo returned from travels there, while Europe adopted the potato from American Indians. In neither case were Europeans enslaved before they could receive a benefit that was the logical heritage of all mankind. But Africans are to be told that the European slave trade developed us by bringing maize and cassava. All of the points above are taken from books and articles published recently as the fruit of research in major British and American universities. They are probably not the commonest views even among European bourgeois scholars, but they are representative of a growing trend that seems likely to become the new accepted orthodoxy in metropolitan capitalist countries. And this significantly coincides with Europe's struggle against the further decolonization of Africa economically and mentally. In one sense, it is preferable to ignore such rubbish and isolate our youth from its insults. But unfortunately, one of the aspects of current African underdevelopment is that the capitalist publishers and bourgeois scholars dominate the scene and help mold opinions the world over. It is for that reason that writing of the type which justifies the trade in slaves has to be exposed as racist bourgeois propaganda, having no connection with reality or logic. It is a question not merely of history, but a present-day liberation struggle in Africa. And I'm glad he said that, because, even materially speaking, just talking about the dialectic, not even talking about the ethical implications of engaging in slavery, exactly what is the practical benefit that you hope to achieve when you enslave people that you don't think you would be able to achieve without, a slave economy? Because one of the things he's mentioning here is what were the specific resources he was bringing up? He was talking about how trade was necessarily facilitated without coercion among people who ended up being colonized later down the line. How potatoes were freely traded. How what was this other thing that he mentioned? It was potatoes and some other spaghetti. He was talking about the Chinese. He said the Italians took the idea of the spaghetti type foods from the Chinese noodle after Marco Polo returned from travels there. But this idea that like development could only even have happened in the first place under a capitalistic mode of production doesn't even necessarily seem to hold up. Because I mean, you often do hear the idea that capitalism itself was like a progressive mode of production from feudalism, which definitely does seem to be the case objectively speaking. But does does better necessarily mean it's what we had to stop at in order to get to where we're going, which is building socialism and then eventually world communism? Because I don't know, I'm not convinced of that. Well, and I'm kind of curious about y'all's thoughts on whether or not we had to get to capitalism before we can get to socialism, because that seems to be a point of contention among Marxists to this day. This idea of like the staged approach to history, where you have to like go level to level without skipping a beat in order to eventually get to the end goal. But like, from what y'all understand, if y'all are willing to talk about it, does that even seem to have any basis in reality? Like, what's y'all's opinion on that question? I see people are typing in the chat, so
I mean,
I'll
like
give that.
you see, like Russia and like China and stuff, like they were pretty feudal when they had the revolution, right? Like they weren't fully
Yeah,
like capitalists,
yeah, yeah. I
and they
mean,
didn't and they didn't have
yeah,
to like really go into that too much to
yeah. I
develop.
mean,
Like the social relations, like they still kept it like it wasn't
mhm,
fully capitalist. Like even if they did like adopt certain things from capitalism, like do you know what I mean? Like markets and stuff.
right. Like, and I'd have to do more research into it, but it's been taught to me by like Chinese comrades who I have relationships with that like China tried all kinds of different modes of production uh, before Mao, before Chairman Mao. They tried liberal bourgeois democracy. They obviously tried a more monarchistic approach. They have what we they have the modern CPC that we know of today, and even apparatuses that necessarily precede the CPC. So Zoe says fully developed capitalism does have to exist, but not in the country where you're having your revolution. Uh, so, like, what does that mean that like there has to be some sort of contradiction for socialism to resolve? But does the concept of socialism itself only necessarily uh, rise up when there are capitalistic class antagonisms? Is that so? And that means that necessarily it has to exist somewhere, even if not in the country that's making the revolution. Uh, City Boy Kwame says, honestly, I think it's just similar to a liberal justification of DemSoc. I feel like it's a form of justification of the lack of progress, rather than understanding the need to abolish feudalism and capitalism. Yeah, Zoe's looking like for a point on this, so I'll wait for them to get their resource that they wanted to cite. So, let me reread City Boy's comment. They said, honestly, I think it's similar to a liberal justification of democratic socialism. I feel like it's a form of justification of the lack of progress rather than understanding the need to abolish feudalism and capitalism. So are you saying like you feel like it's working backward from the conclusion rather than doing a material analysis, City Boy, so that it doesn't have to try to engage with any idea that we could have just gone straight to socialism?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Like, I just feel like it just sort of sounds like a compromise rather than, just getting straight to the point. Because if we analyze, I guess like global capitalism or just, the historical context of everything, I feel like if we just start saying, oh, well, we needed capitalism to get away from feudalism, we could also use that same argument for, oh, well, we needed dem socialism, or rather, what people would prefer Nordic, you know what I'm trying to say? A Nordic model, which is like a social democracy, where we just, we get to this and then we'll eventually get to that. When like, I don't know, maybe I sound like an anarchist, but
No,
like I,
that's not what that sounds
but
like to
like
me. Because like you do hear oftentimes in today's conditions that like social democracy is itself a prerequisite to like suing the conditions that necessarily lead to a revolutionary situation, which like that just obviously doesn't hold up in
Of
any kind of material reality. Like, I mean, even living in
of course.
America,
And like
like,
it's still not, and
uh-huh.
it's still a form of capitalism. It's still reserving reserving certain rights for people of a specific class. So we're not trying to do grassroots from the bottom up. I don't really feel like that's an actual concrete point. You know what I mean? I don't think that there is any form of justification for capitalism as, oh well, it's just, it's just the midpoint between, feudalism and socialism. I don't really feel like that's valid because we can make that same argument for basically any form of whatchamacallit, of like a quote unquote economic system between capitalism and socialism. Like I feel like this is sort of counterproductive. You know what I mean? We're not really focusing on those who are the most exploited, which would be the Black and Indigenous people, the lowest classes. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's like, and I'm super interested in Zoe's point too, because what they're saying is like, or seem to be saying anyway, and they're going to correct me in a second, but like, you need like capitalism itself as a necessary development before you can. It seems to be saying that capitalism itself and its mode of production necessarily creates the super exploitation that can then somehow, or because it definitely has been the case that super exploitation does end up leading to to revolution, and like the super exploitation itself uh is being perpetrated by one country, but the country that it's perpetrating against that country, which might necessarily end up rising in revolution, might obviously itself not be a capitalistic country. So, like, if, for example, Mozambique, which is not a capitalistic country, is responding to the super exploitation that necessarily results from the contradictions of capitalism. Then capitalism's role in things was a necessary prerequisite for the radicalization of the working class, possibly. Because, like, if that's the argument, I could see an argument for that. Not from the standpoint that capitalism is necessary for the benefit of the working class, but that capitalism itself fundamentally and through its own logic creates the conditions that people end up revolting under. Because like that just seems to line up with everything that we're talking about. So Zoe says, I can't find a section. The gist of it was that the Russian bourgeoisie was a weak class, unable to fulfill the historic role of resolving the peasant question and moving the development of society onward. So the only possibility was for the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie and take power directly. Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, because like, it even seems to be the case now that like socialism appeals more to those who have already considered capitalism as an alternative and have found it through material analysis to like not be a workable system. Because like when you look at the logic of capitalism, and when you as a marginalized person take your natural interest in achieving decolonization, you do inevitably come to view that capitalism itself is the facilitator of imperialism, the facilitator of colonialism, and that its existence is the antithesis of anything close to freedom for you and your family, your loved ones, your friends, those who matter to you the most. And as such, you can't have both capitalism and decolonization. And like that's a conclusion many working class people could only come to if they're facing down capitalism. Not to necessarily say they wouldn't be able to reach that conclusion without capitalism, but capitalism certainly, just like I said, by its logic, it does help along that conclusion, and that is the conclusion you inevitably come to if you engage the world dialectically. So Zoe says, what I mean about fully developed capitalism is that you have to remember Marx's specific work was a product of specific material conditions. The contradictions of capitalism were fully exposed in Victorian England when he was writing and observing, and thus it was possible for him to predict the course of society beyond capitalism. Okay, so like, you're not talking about it as a force for progress. You're talking about it as an analytical mode. And I mean, that's what Marx was talking about it as an analytical mode from which we can extrapolate, where the path is from here for the progression of our species, really.
It just sort of creates the material condition from which like socialism is more likely to rise out of, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Because like that
Oh, yeah,
just reads. That makes perfect sense.
I was also thinking something else. When you read like Engels and stuff, like he talks about how like one of the contradictions of capitalism is the it's a socialization of production, but the like individual appropriation. So I was just thinking like that might be something that it does as well. Like because before that, it's like individual artisans just creating like a whole product. But I'm not sure if you need capitalism to like socialize production. Do you know what I mean? Because you could probably do it without like.
You talking about developing the productive forces without the capitalistic mode of production?
Yeah, but like specifically like socializing production. So like instead of one person doing like the whole thing, like you just get a bunch of people and everyone does like each like specific section and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't think you need capitalism to do that though.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Zoe says
that's just the way it happened, I guess.
That is the way it's happened, and like really, it's like not even possible to know what could have come without capitalism, because that might be one of those like absurd like what ifs that Rodney was alluding to in 4.1. So Zoe says there's a level on which it is necessary for the development of productive forces. It centralizes and socializes labor on a completely unprecedented scale. So like, yeah, I mean, that's true. The scale at which productive forces, I mean, for fuck's sake, the Soviet Union industrialized from an agrarian society as in the early 20th century to being able to like build a fucking apparatus that was able to like successfully resist and beat back the Nazis, and then go into the fucking 60s and win the space race dominantly. Like that's an unprecedented achievement in human history, and like developing the productive forces as fast as they did was definitely an achievement of capitalism. And that's whether people like to admit that was that there was capitalism going on inside the country or not. That's not even something Lenin himself seems to like deny. He seems more interested in fighting back against the idea that like any presence of capitalism at all necessarily implies imperialism, which is like probably a more interesting conversation to have. But fuck, there is examples of wide scale development over a very small amount of time that like I suppose could be said to argue for like the efficiency that capitalism can do in terms of like the development of the productive forces in the world economy. So I mean, I guess I can definitely see that point, because like I don't know, I'd be working backwards in my conclusion to even argue otherwise. And Zoe says primitive accumulation is the most brutal process in existence, and it doesn't really get better once you move from the formal subsumption of production of capitalism to the real subsumption. And City Boy says capitalism does sow the seeds of its own demise, but I don't believe that needing to be exploited yourself should have to be what radicalized people. Absolutely, you don't need to be exploited to be radicalized, but like it does seem to be the case that like capitalism itself, well, like you was just saying, it sowed the seeds of its own demise. So what that necessarily means is like the very real resources that we'll use to get that boot off of our neck was necessarily developed rapidly and effectively, by the forces of capitalism. It's the last capitalist we hang will be the one who sold us the rope adage, So like that does seem to be true because like the forces of capitalism have been used to make successful socialist revolution before, like that's just one of the facts of our proletarian history. Now, what you end up getting into is like whether there was any socialism present at all as a consequence of that, and God knows if you ask 3 Marxists that question, you'll end up with 10 different answers. But yeah, it does seem to be the case that capitalism did rapidly produce or rapidly expand the forces of production in such a way in some countries that the workers were able to organize to like use those to their own advantage. And I mean, even now, there's still more so-called worker democracy, even under this mode of production, than there would have been under a system like capitalism. There's worker co-ops under capitalism and shit like that. So even as shitty as it is, I mean, there has to be a reason Marx called it a progressive force for its time. So that's a fair enough thing to point out. But yeah, the exploitation itself is not necessarily necessary, but it is definitely the consequence you would expect based on the logic of capitalism. So Sadu is typing. I'll respond to what it is they're saying, and then we'll wrap up. But yeah, and City Boy says, I understand that for sure, but I feel like that's just like an empathy for those most exploited. To me, it sounds like, damn, I didn't think about how healthcare matters until I was kicked off my parents' plan. Lately, events have been making me reconsider or think more hardly on the revolutionary situation here in the States. And like one of the arguments I think about is this whole argument conservatives love to make about people just want free stuff, and I used to like really push back against that argument because on its head, radicals could never be really broken down into such like a simple accusation or like, oh, you're a radical because you want free shit, because like the abolishment of money itself is obviously a goal of ours, but like that's so far away from being like the driving motivator that it makes it obvious that there's no real understanding of what radicals believe and what we want from those people. But then I start thinking about like these so-called leftists, the sock dams, and yeah, the damn socks too, and definitely people who unironically identify themselves as liberal, and how like it just seems to be the case that these people can be bought off, with like slight material gain. There's like a reason why the like capitalist class always eventually feels comfortable making concessions. And it does seem to be the case that like revolution can be quelled, at least in the case of America, by just like giving people a little bit of what they want in terms of like material demand. So like it might necessarily be the case one day that the ruling class decides to acquiesce to something like Medicare for all or one of the other tepid demands of the liberals whenever it feels like it can't afford to not give concessions anymore. And like if in that situation we find ourselves with a revolutionary fervor that's being watered down by liberals, then like maybe it'll just be true that the conservatives have a point that hell, some people really do only care about free stuff, and it's not just a criticism of their goals, but it is a condemnation of like their fucking principles and like what they want. Like, because if you can call yourself a revolutionary, get some health care, and all of a sudden revolution doesn't seem like the thing that we need to be doing to you. Like maybe you weren't even there in the fucking first place. So like that's, I mean, I'll obviously marinate on that thought more, but it's just like something I've been thinking and I wanted to share that with y'all. Sadhu Serb says, I do agree with this though. I think some countries can just skip the capitalist phase by just appropriating all the advances in production technology from other capitalist countries without actually being capitalists themselves. Yeah, I definitely want to investigate that. Zoe says, things would have gone so much better for the Soviet Union if the German Revolution had been successful because they would have been able to import the technology that they needed to set up self-sufficient industry. Instead, they had to reinvent the wheel, basically, and the people had to make incredible sacrifices for decades to get the country in a state where it could produce all the means of production it needed. Factory machinery, locomotives, tractors, tanks, and AKs. Incidentally, Kalashnikov wanted to design tractors, but the whole situation with the Nazis meant he had to go into into a different kind of engineering. And I mean, one of the underrated things that you just don't hear, everybody really should read Dizzy with Success. Dizzy with Success is Stalin's like self-crit on, to some extent anyways, a self-crit on what's going on with the project of collectivization in the USSR. And Dizzy with Success, he's criticizing the very idea that the collectivization process could be successful with coercion. He's going into the idea that collectivization itself can only be achievable via voluntary entrance into the program. And actually, history seems to not have borne that out, actually. Like, what we know to have been coming, it seems to be the case that involuntary seizure of kulak assets and conscription into the collectivization program would have been the way to go. It could like not only was the so-called repressive USSR not anywhere near as repressive as what we're told, it might even be the case that whether people like to hear it or not, they weren't authoritarian enough, for quickly enough in the early 30s. Like this is like some of the critics, because like Stalin's bringing up these criticisms and Dizzy with Success of himself, but with what we know of the scale of the Nazi invaders, it might necessarily be the case that they should have just gone with the process. And I mean, obviously it worked out in the end, but of just telling the kulaks to fuck off sooner. Because when he's writing Dizzy with Success, what's happening through Europe is there's all kinds of European powers, France, Britain, etc., who are making, deals different with the Nazis than what the Soviet Union was eventually forced to do by, of course, the nature politically that the Europeans have fucking created. So like if you're seeing that and you're not ramping up production to be able to eventually resist the powder keg that is Nazi Germany eventually sparking off a war, you're probably not really engaging the situation as dialectically as you could be. So yeah, y'all should check out Dizzy with Success. I should grab it might be on Marxist.org. Let me see. Dizzy with Success.
I put it there already. Yeah, I was looking at
it.
it.
You put it there? Awesome. Yeah. And check that out. And I kind of want to hear y'all's opinions on it. So if y'all read it, I'll ask y'all about it next week and see what y'all have to say about it. Because like when I read it, I was just like, not only does it like debunk this idea of like thoughtless Stalin and like that he was just this mindless brute, but like I'm actually not even sure I agree with all of his conclusions there, given what we know today. So yeah, y'all check that out and let me know what y'all's thoughts are. So yeah, it was good spending time with y'all. Glad to have gotten this. We'll get to section 4.2 next week. We're going to be continuing the Michael Parenti on Saturday with Inventing Reality. This will, of course, be put on YouTube for those comrades who missed it. You comrades know I love y'all. Solidarity always. And then until next time, ta-ta for now.